Cool. All right. As long as everyone can hear me, which I'm pretty sure you can. I'm Seth Schumacher. I am kind of a hybrid person. I work for a company called Voss Solutions. We are an automation solution company. We automate UC systems. So Cisco, Teams, Zoom, Avaya, all that fun stuff. And then I also do direct engineering. I come out of the engineering world deploying direct routing for large, enterprise and government, as well as the rest of Teams voice. But I kind of developed a perverse fascination with the way E911 is being asked to be implemented in the things we have to do, the contortions we have to go through to try and accommodate some very interesting requests from the people who wrote the regulations. On that note, as always, thank you to the people who actually make a conference like this possible and keep our ticket prices down. I don't know about you, but I like coming to a conference like this that's technical, costs me $200 instead of $2,000, and I actually learned something, kind of nice. So thank you, people. In this case, because Torin is going to be delivering a talk a little bit later, I believe it's tomorrow, and he's going to be going into some of the more nitty-gritty on if you're doing calling policy, why would you notify someone this way versus that way? Why would you choose necessarily a BSSID over a switch port? I'm not going to necessarily cover all of that. If you have questions, ask them, I'll answer them. This is going to kind of be a little bit more of a, what is E911? What is next generation 911? How is it meant to work? How is Teams dealing with it? And how can we deal with it as a general industry? I've already introduced myself, I apologize, but here's me. I'm also a mountain nut, so Colorado's kind of perfect for me. But if you can't get a hold of me after the conference or just randomly, I'm open to helping whenever I can. It's probably because I am out of both cell and satellite service. So just be aware. So to get started with, there's been this whole rigmarole about what is going on with emergency services in the modern world. Right now, the US and Canada had to be all sorts of special and say, hey, we need to do things, in a new way because things happened and there were some knee-jerk reactions that were good, but at the same time, a little overreaching in my opinion. And so in the early part of the 21st century, some concepts came about when they started discussing how can we make our emergency response or emergency responders more effective. The old method of tagging your individual landlines with the service address and just assuming you're going there. And that worked when you were dealing with a landline like that. But how do we do that in the oncoming age of mobile phones and voice over IP? So they came up with essentially two different systems, E911 and NG911. And E911 is the precursor. It's the first of the two. And it's what we deal with today. NG911, however, is the goal. E911 is what you're already used to. It's, hey, when you deliver a call to, and rather than have this rub, I'll get rid of it. When you deliver a call to a PSAP, deliver a location. Tell them exactly where you are. Yay, lovely, wonderful. NG911 is the next generation that very few PSAPs in the world can actually accommodate. The technology exists, but nothing really uses it. And this adds the ability to say, hey, I just dialed you from my cell phone. I've got someone bleeding out here on the university campus. Here's a picture of what's going on. And a doctor can be tied in on the other end and brought in via video to say, hey, while EMS is on its way, do X, Y, and Z. It adds a whole lot of modality. It basically turns 911 into a UC system, if you will, and says, hey, throw all your modalities together and let's make this all work. Big question, kind of as I alluded to before though, why would we want to do this? Why would we want to put ourselves through this hell of trying to make this all work? Well, there are three laws that really were driven. I said it was a little knee-jerk. It is and it isn't. The first one to think about is Kari's Law, at least in the US. And Kari's Law is named for Kari Hunt, who was in a hotel murdered by her husband, and her 9-year-old daughter was trying to dial 911, and because she didn't know she needed to dial 9 to get an outside line, she couldn't reach emergency responders. That law was passed before BAUM, and it basically said, look, number one, no one should ever have to dial for an outside line to get to emergency services, whether it's 911 or not. Any emergency service number should be reachable without a prefix. Done. Secondly, that basically said, oh, well, what if I'm in a multi-unit facility? Well, someone needs to be notified. So whether it's the front desk manager of the hotel, whether it's if you've got an on-campus PSAP and you're lucky, great. Your on-campus security or your whatever, they need to be notified. The BAUM Act had 2 phases. Now, we can thank the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate for the acronym and the weird name, because I originally always thought it was named after a guy named BAUM. Well, not so much. It's an acronym, yes. And it's such a, self-explanatory, even when you expand it, it's so self-explanatory, isn't it? It really is. BAUM basically had 2 phases, and the gist of BAUM is what we're here for today. It's how deliver the dispatchable location to the PSAP. That's the big piece of it. It had 2 phases. Phase 1, fixed location, your common area phones, your fixed phones, your pedestals, if you have emergency pedestals, whatever they are. Phase 2, which went into place January of 2022, was your mobile users. It was whether you're roaming or whether you're on Wi-Fi, you're on a laptop. In Canada, the only other country in the world to implement this system, there are 2, they call them telecom decisions. In 2007, the first was, hey, we're noticing that when people are placing 911 calls using voice over the internet, providers are often delivering them on low priority lines and they're dropping. So the first telecom decision said, hey, when you deliver an emergency call in Canada, it must be on a high priority line, and if you have other lines you have to drop to make this call go through, this call goes through. 2022-265 is the latest of all of the other decisions that led up to where Canada's system is now, and it's effectively an equivalent of BAUM, deliver the dispatchable location. Now, one thing I want to be very clear on with E911, it's really, and the next generation will follow, it's really dependent on how your PSAP system is organized. And one of the reasons we don't see Europe adopting this anywhere near as readily as the US is the fact that in the US, our PSAPs, there is little comparative regulation on who runs them and how they're run. There's some basics absolutely you have to comply with, but in Canada, it's one system. It's run by the feds. You dial in, it's there, everything's on the same platform. In the US, I'm rural Montana, right? My PSAP is not New York City's. We don't have all of the various ingress, egress abilities they do, right? So implementing these things, we have different regulations that go along with it, and we have different timelines. Key terms you're gonna hear me use, you're probably already all familiar with these. ANI, which is the automatic number identification. That's the precursor for caller ID. It's when you're presented a phone number when someone calls you, that's the ANI. ALI is location identification. And that these combined were the old method of E911. When you registered for a landline with your phone company, your number, your ANI, was assigned to you, and it was assigned to the ALI, the location identification of your house, your business, your whatever. So whenever you hear an old school person talk about ANI, ALI lookup, that's what they mean. ELIN was a special ANI, if you will, and if you had, before E911 and digital network identification was available, if you wanted to simulate this, what you would do is you'd say, hey, I've got, anytime a user calls from phone X, Y, or Z and they call 911 in our case, I want you to replace their outbound caller ID with a certain number. And that number is what's registered with an ALI at the carrier to say, hey, boom, this is where you need to go. And then the system on the other end, on your PBX, had to know if that number gets called back within a definable time frame, redirect it to the original caller. That's an ELIN. DID, everyone here should be familiar with. It's your standard direct inward dial. It's the phone number you assign to a user. MLTS, which is what the laws, again, thank you for brevity, our laws, multi-line telephone system. Dispatchable location, we've been talking about this in several sessions today. Everyone knows what this is at this point. For the US, the slides, of course, will be available after the presentations. Here's the way the federal government defines it. We'll get into a little bit later how it's something of a nebulous term, but it's effectively what door do I have to kick down to find the person who's in trouble. Notification is out of Kari's law, and it's a good term to use, but it's also misleading because notification can mean a number of things and can be any of them can be compliant with Kari's law. Static location, which was part of BAUM Phase 1. If you have a fixed device, what's a static location? I can assign it. I'm not worried about it. It's what you do when you're doing calling plans, operator connect, when you're assigning a location to a user in Teams today. Nomadic location is exactly what we're focused on today. E911, dynamic location detection, whether that's network identifiable or you're on a cell phone, you're at Starbucks, you're wherever. So the back end of E911, how do we actually make this happen, right? Now, whether you're using Teams or another system, there's an LIS, there's a location information server or service. And within that system, you're going to have, and I didn't include this as a key term, and it comes out of Intrado, who was kind of the first to really build this, and they helped build most of the PSAPs in the US, an ERN, Emergency Resource Number, or ERL, Emergency Resource Locator. In this case, that's our emergency address. That's saying, hey, here's the physical location, the postal address, here's where you drive to. Within that, you can subdivide, right? You can absolutely say, hey, I want an additional location for my floor, my room, my whatever. Or if you're campus with one physical address, you can say, hey, show up to the physical address, but go to Johnson Hall rather than the student union building. Network identifiers, everyone here should be familiar with what these are, but public IPs, a subnet, a switch. How many of you think you know what a wireless access point BSSID is? How many of you think it's the name of the network being broadcast by the wireless access point? Okay, so no, the BSSID, this is one thing I really want to make sure, if you take nothing else out of this particular presentation, is generally an amalgamation of the MAC address of the access point itself in reverse. Meraki being one of the weird exceptions. Meraki, we can, if you have Meraki and you want to know how to get all this stuff, talk to me later. And then if you have, in modern wireless access points, most of them are what we call 4x4 radios or 6x6 radios. They effectively have 6 radios or 4. Each radio then adds a separate tag to the end of this hexadecimal string, and that is for each SSID or broadcast network coming off of this access point. So if you have a public and a private network and you have a 4x4 radio, you're going to have 8 BSSIDs coming off of that access point. 4 for the public, 4 for the private, 1 for each radio. You need to know all of those to put them into your LIS. So you can understand why this one causes consternation with a lot of people, especially if you're deploying access points without an access point controller. So sure.
For that. Are the BSSIDs close enough in naming convention where you can use like a wildcard to define?
Yes. So depending on the system, Microsoft allows for wildcards in its system. Usually the BSSID, the prefix will always be the same for the physical access point, right? Like I said, it's usually based off of the first few octets of the hexadecimal string of the MAC address. It's always the follow-up ones that you need to worry about. Caveat is you've got to get far enough in that hexadecimal string to make sure that you don't have like serial number adjacent access points where they intersect. Public IP location registration, or IP geolocation, this is how Google knows where the heck you are when you're doing Google Maps, right? Get me directions from where I am to where I'm going. Most ISPs out there have to register where they've got their IPv4, not so much IPv6, but their IPv4 ranges. Where do the IP addresses refer to geographically? If you're using a mobile phone or you're lucky enough to have, a super rugged laptop that has a GPS chip in it, great. GPS coordinates are exactly what we'd expect. They're latitude, longitude. And then manual location entry. Well, that's rather self-explanatory. We can use any and all of these to help us find a location. All right, but what the bloody hell do we do with all that information once we know where we are? Well, for me to get this information into the system to the PSAP, the calling, no matter whether you're using direct routing, operator connect, calling plans, any of the above, the back end is the same. It's all SIP. It's all voice interaction on the back end. And at the bottom of the invite, the first packet that comes in any SIP call is what we call a PIDFlow packet. Now it's an XML formatted packet, and one of the really important things to see, is that at the bottom, right after or right above the SDP, I cut out the SDP, which is what defines media in a SIP call. is you're going to have an accept that adds this application/PIDF XML, and then at the bottom of the thing, you're going to have this giant XML packet that basically says, okay, yeah, there's location data here. And then really importantly, you're going to have the entity, and then you're going to have, hey, here's the location info. And it's broken down into segments, so you have your cities, your addresses, and everything else. This particular example doesn't include an ELIN. If an ELIN were included in this string, there would be an ELIN section.
What does the geolocation CID filter for? What's going on?
Where do you, oh, up above?
Second header from the top. Yeah.
So you can see it's basically not hexadecimal, I apologize. It's a generated string that, depending on the ERS provider, they may leverage to say, hey, I can get your location out of this. Usually what will happen is, I don't see it in this list, but down in this section you will have lat long included, and they'll use that lat long to figure out where you are.
So is that encoded in that string, or is that string just a key that they look up and find an address?
Technically it's an optional string. So you don't have to worry about that string itself. The big ones you really want to worry about are the accept and this giant, under the unique boundary string that this is the application PDF XML. Work with this, right? That's what they're going to work off of. So in the end, whatever information you're providing to the PSAP is going to be in this packet. And if you were in Jamie's session just a minute ago, right? And he was talking about, hey, well, if you dial 911, but you're coming from a laptop that had the operating system provide the location, even if you manually accepted it, we're not considering that authoritative. Well, it's not in this particular example, but usually right in this beginning area and right above where lat long would be if we had lat long, it would have that tag that says, hey, this is authoritative, this is not authoritative. And that's how services like Intrado, Red Sky, Bandwidth, they know, hey, send this to the ECRC, the Emergency Call Responder Center or Call Response Center. Or if none of this matches, right, then they'll do that.
It's not authoritative even if it's accepted by the client owner, even if they go in there and say...
It depends on how the original location was detected. And that's a whole Microsoft thing that is, take that one up with Jamie. Because they decided what is authoritative and what isn't. So when it comes to the delivery, that PID flow is the key part. That's that, and I've seen a lot of implementations where people go to deploy, with direct routing especially, E911, and they connect to Intrado, they connect to Red Sky, they connect to Bandwidth, to whomever their ERS, emergency routing service provider is. And the call comes in from Teams with that PID flow packet, but it never makes it out to Intrado. That's an SBC thing. You got to make sure this is delivered all the way through. However, if you deliver it to AT&T, I'm going to leave you out as an odd example, because normally if I would send it to Lumen, unless they had a special service passing it to Intrado, they would drop the call more times than not.
We actually support that. That's coming for AT&T.
It's coming? Great. I mean, but historically, if you included PID flow, even if the rest of the SIP invite was exactly a routable call, they would drop it. So make sure if you're going to be doing direct routing, you're very careful about if you're using whatever your PSTN carrier as a backup instead of your ERS, that you're very careful to not include PID flow unless they've explicitly told you to include it. All right, so that said, the ERS is what we're talking about now, and I'm going to use Intrado for pretty much all the examples from here on out because they're the big dog in the industry and they basically built the network in the US to help do it. They are the ones who say, hey, I have the entire database of all the PSAPs. I know what their actual boundary jurisdictions are. They had this massive GIS project that they put together, and they literally know, based on coordinates, who has jurisdiction where, which is why you want those validated addresses. We want to know what coordinate you're coming from so we know who to call. Now, if you get the wrong county, you're just over the county line, usually the counties are great about like, no, we got you, you're good. But if you're a state away, it's a big difference, right? So we need to deliver to the ERS so that they can send you to the correct PSAP. Usually, and to this date, it usually has not been your carrier who does this for you. You usually negotiate a separate contract with the CRS provider, and if you're using direct routing, you have a separate trunk to them. If you're using calling plans, Operator Connect, your carrier, or Microsoft is doing that for you. We're going to deliver that to them. The call's going to be placed. Location will have been detected. We'll deliver that to the ERS. They'll send it to the call center. And then someone gets notified. In the US, at least, it's Kari's law. So whether you send that to on-site personnel, off-site personnel, it doesn't matter. Someone just has to be notified. That's up to you, the operator, to choose. The next, and then this is also to Jamie's point in a previous session, Teams currently only allows you two methods of notification, either a textual notification within Teams that says, hey, so-and-so dialed an emergency number from such and such a location if a location was detected, or you can be called. And if you're called, you're either muted, you can hear, but you can't talk to either the caller or the responders, or you're conferenced in. Either way, you have no ability, if you're conferenced in, to then mute yourself, any of the rest of that stuff. You are in. It's one of those options. With Jamie's point, they're building a system, hopefully available this year, we'll see, that allows for at least the notification to be sent via an API to your own system, whether you have your own single wire, I imagine, at the university, if you've used it. Oh. So not at this university, but single wire is probably one of the big ones, so it can set up all the flashers on the alerters or the whatever system you want, or you want to pop up on someone else's desktop that has more information, or a map to come up and say, boom, send security here. That's coming, supposedly. As I mentioned before, if you don't send it to the ERS, if you're sending it to your carrier, you need to make sure you strip that PID flow information and that the caller ID is correct so they can be called back. That will go to the carrier. The carrier will take generally the billing address that's on your account and send it to the PSAP for that account. So you can be in New York and reach an LA PSAP. And they are trained to know, hey, if this has happened, connect back if you can, forward the call back. But you put yourself and your callers at risk if that's the case. And so if you know you aren't going to be able to do dynamic E911, you can't build that contract, you don't have the money for it, that's where ELINs come in, and you use your ELINs so that the carriers can route you correctly. Well, we've been talking about complications all the whole time here, but as Ben alluded to, if you were in his session earlier, as Jamie mentioned just a bit ago, God, Teams is a hot mess when it comes to location information. It goes everywhere, it's indiscriminate, and it's not standardized by any means. We had a question in, I think it was it Ben's session about, hey, I want to put my IP addresses into the LIS, the emergency location database, and it won't let me put in a subnet. And this is one of the first things I always discuss on an E911 contract with a customer is, if you're going to use subnets, if you're going to plug them in the LIS, Microsoft did the stupidest thing humanly possible for this database. They asked you to put in the network address. How many of you are network engineers who know how to calculate a network address? Okay, how many of you are good at it? How many of you are good at subnetting? Oh, great. And how good are you at doing it with IPv6? All right. Well, thank you, Microsoft, for not just building that logic in. And so, complications, right? How do you properly fill out this LIS? I can't tell you the number of customers I've dealt with who've kind of tried to do this on their own, and they're like, we're not getting the correct location. We get it sometimes with this one, sometimes with that one. They went in and just put in all their /24s. Didn't matter if they were DHCP providing it as a /23 or /20. They were just putting in all their /24 subnets, thinking, oh, it won't let me put in a slash or a subnet mask in the LIS. Well, if the computer that actually has an address in that /24 is looking for a network address that's two, in the previous octet, 2 numbers above it, and it's not showing on that computer, you're screwed. So what Teams does literally is when it gets its network information, it says, what is my IP address and what is my subnet mask? And it calculates its network mask, or its network address from that, and that network address is what it sends to Microsoft to match.
So a question for you now. What if you've got a situation, I know this would be bad network engineering to run into this, but let's say you've got a 10110/24, you've got a 10110/26, right? Both of them would have a 10110 network address, right? Mm-hmm. But the subnet mask after that would be different. So but you can't plug that same string in the LIS. You can't overlap them currently, remember? Right. So the first 10110 is what it's going to work with. Okay, that's where I was going with that. There's no way to uniquely identify those. saying?
No,
Okay.
not in Teams currently, right? If they were on separate sites, and Jamie. So the question was, what if you had 10, in this case, a 10110 for the recording, subnet that was a /24, and then elsewhere in the environment you had a 10110/26. Since they both have the same network address, and the network address is what you put in the LIS, and it must be unique, you could only put it in at one site. You can begin to understand why, and I'll allude to this later, network teams bloody well hate me. Like, they love me when I go to put in the phone service, and then we get to E911. I'm not talking about CQD. I'm not talking about the locate sites and policy databases, but you've got to put this information in everywhere. So you're acquiring it once, or build it the whole way. Well, now you've got to also build those emergency calling policies. You've got to define who's being notified, why are they being notified, when should they be notified, and Torin can answer any more complex questions in his talk coming up. It's tomorrow, right, Torin? Tomorrow, sorry. You got to build those out. And then on top of that, you got to build emergency call routing policies if you're doing direct routing, where you've got to be able to define what are the emergency dial strings. And I love this part because I can set it up so that I don't care if you're coming from Europe, you're dialing 112, 120, 999, whatever. I can remask those as 911 and shoot it out and not have to worry about training you to dial 911. But I have to build those policies and I have to assign them to people. Then what if I'm in an environment that has multiple connectivity types? Well, now I have to make sure that, if it's calling plans, if it's operator connect, I just got to make sure Microsoft has it and it works. If it's direct routing, well, now I've got all this other stuff to throw on top of it. Here's kind of where I originally had the meat of this presentation intending to be, but since everyone here said they're doing Teams native, I don't have to spend as much time on it. What if you're running multiple PBXs, multiple line telephone systems, as the legislation actually calls it? Oh, it gets fun. So especially when you did your migrations, if you were from, say, Cisco or Avaya to Microsoft Teams, the big ones, and you were doing it just as BAUM was going into effect or just after, and there was potentially a partial attempt at compliance. How do you get it so that while you're in that hybrid mode, both systems can be compliant? Well, Microsoft gave us a great big middle finger on that one. It used to be, with Skype for Business, the predecessor, that you could use what's called HELD, the HTTP Emergency Location Detection Protocol. And what would happen in Skype for Business is you would provide a URL in a PowerShell policy, and it would say, hey, whether it's a soft client, whether it's a hard phone, anytime you sign onto the network or you move, your network identification changes, send a query to this web service, and it will tell you where you are. It will provide you your location information. And Skype for Business had the ability to do some of this itself. You could put your subnets in, you could put in location information. But if you had Cisco and Skype or Avaya, or all three, right, all of them would query this one system. And this one system which had the ability to do things like SNMP crawls, API queries to your wireless BSS or your wireless access point controllers. Granted, in this case, it was ERS service provider dependent, right? This is Intrado I'm talking about. Red Sky had something similar. Secure 911 has their own. Bandwidth does not. But the idea is you could integrate everything to that, do all your updates there, and it could do some dynamic stuff, and then it would integrate with Intrado or your ERS provider. How do we do that now? Well, with Microsoft, we're kind of hosed. The best method I've found has been with the Intrado EGW, although the Red Sky Location Manager can do this to an extent, where you can build some scripts that will export that data, convert it into Teams ingestible formats, and ingest it into Teams. Teams, unfortunately, with their separate civic address and location IDs, make it interesting to make sure that you can match properly, programmatically, those endpoints. And so that's about as far as I'll go with MLT, multiple platforms. If you have another one you want to integrate, come talk to me afterwards. But there are ways you can do this that allow you to build the data in one place and then programmatically get it either into Teams and into other systems. You had a question?
Yeah, you mentioned EGW. I'm familiar with that product. If you've got Microsoft Teams, which supports Pitiful, and you've got EGW, which converts the data to a Pitiful format as well, do you need EGW with Teams at all? Is there any benefit to having both of those?
Okay, so the question is, if you're using Intrado and you're using their EGW, their emergency gateway product, is there a benefit to having both in the line of call? And yes, there is a benefit. because what the EGW does is what the LIS does for Teams, right? It adds the PID flow to the emergency call. When you have EGW with Teams, what you end up doing is saying, hey, look at the PID flow from Teams, accept it, pass it on. But if you have ERLs, which is what they're defined, the emergency addresses, if you will, or locations in the EGW, and they match, the EGW has way more notification capabilities than does Microsoft Teams. They have a special application you can use. They can do local conferencing from the SIP right there rather than just through Teams. They can tie into just about anything with that. So there's a benefit of having an EGW even on top of Teams, but it takes that additional configuration. If you want to go just bypass and go straight to Intrado, you can. Intrado will do that for you, but there are benefits.
So to your point earlier, if you wanted to kind of combine everything from an E911 functionality standpoint, you've got a mix of Cisco, Avaya, and Microsoft in the environment. EGW can be that bridge, right? So basically normalize everything into a beautiful format and send it out to the
So the question is, if you had the multiple systems, could the EGW be that bridge? The answer to that is yes and no. So you would still have to independently maintain your LIS in both locations. Yes, there are ways. I've gotten rid of my old scripts to try and do this. We were partially successful in saying, hey, let's export the database from the EGW. Let's manipulate it so it can be imported into Teams. At a certain point, was in discussions with Intrado to say, look, guys, just figure out a way to do this for us, right? Just build it as part of the platform, and it's a selling point. And no one has done this. Sorry? An API of some sort? So the problem with Teams is there is no API for telephony. They are working on a Graph API endpoint. And I'm being a little facetious because there is a back-end API that is not supported by end user use by Microsoft, but it is what the TAC queries. It is what the PowerShell is converting to. So when you do a PowerShell query for Teams nowadays, PowerShell locally is converting it to an API request and sending an API request. It is no longer a PowerShell remoting session between you and the cloud. It is an API. And it is this API that you can programmatically access, but it's not supported by Microsoft. And if Microsoft finds out about it, they will send you a cease and desist letter. No, of course not. I do not speak from experience. So we've asked for this. They're thinking, we're working on it, the common response from Microsoft. I actually kind of believe them on that one. They have to be, because this is asinine. This is way more work than it needs to be when there are so many ways we could fix this. Let's throw contact centers into the mix. How many of you guys have used Genesys? Okay. How many of you successfully deployed E911 with Genesys? Yeah, and then all the hands go down. But I like the why would you response, because that's my exact response. Tell that to the customer who says, well, it's also going to be my PBX because of whatever, right? How do you, again, there's the EGW, which they don't necessarily integrate with, but a third-party solution to try and tie everything together. Generally, what you end up seeing with call centers that are not Teams integrated, right? You're going to have that, hey, you're going to be doing anti-alley matching at either an EGW, at an Intrado level, where the call goes to Intrado without PID flow, and they have to look it up in their system and say, this number is tied to this location, which in that case then requires an extra application sitting on your desktop where you, the user, when you sign in, have to say, this is my location, and it updates at Intrado or Red Sky or Bandwidth or wherever, so that when you dial out, your number rolls. But that doesn't work great when you're using 3 different clients to place the call, because it overrides each time you update that.
I've heard Genesys, the cloud Genesys platforms get separate configuration. I never did that.
So Cloud Genesys, you can deliver your own SIP trunks, and you can do E911 through it, but the same thing, you end up using Intrado, and you plug into anti-alleys to say, boom, go. At least last time I did it, they may have updated and changed. Now, fortunately, what happens if you are Teams integrated, right? What if with especially the new Teams phone extensibility solution, and you're actually using your Teams client to do this? Well, then perfect, you just saved yourselves a boatload of additional work, because now they're just using the Teams client, right? Or the Teams LIS. Now, whether you're using the web edition through the contact center or not, that changes things up a little bit. But boom, all of a sudden, you've got everything taken care of for you. Now, what if you're, Zoom, the big, other competitor, does a similar thing, right? They have an LIS themselves, right? Neither they nor Teams comply with held or use held, which would be great because the EGW was a held compliant solution. And in, I believe it was Jamie's session earlier, we were talking about, well, what if you are failing to truly match that you're on net, but your subnets may overlap, they may, whatever. Well, back in the day of the Skype for Businesses, you could get around that with an EGW because if you couldn't query the EGW because it was locally accessible on the network only, you were off net. So with a held compliant solution, unless you're querying over the internet, of course, which is where things would go, if you could reach it, you were on-prem. No need to know what your public IPs were. You could roll. Contact centers, as we just talked about, Genesis. Is PIDFlow supported? Well, it'll pass it through, but will it generate it? No. Landis is great, but it's using Teams. Teams does that all for you. Great. What if you're using hybrid analog or VoIP, right? You've got an analog estate, whether you're using emergency pedestals that are still analog or you converted them to VoIP, whatever they are. If you're using an emergency page button, right? You're in a factory, you hit the red button and it immediately calls emergency services. How do you make sure that works? Well, there's the Annie Alley. If they're, again, if you're using Intrado, right, you can say, hey, I don't need to put this information in Teams because this device doesn't go through Teams. I'm going to go to Intrado and say, if someone calls from this number, this is where they're coming from. What if that emergency pedestal has a phone number of 1234? All of a sudden now you have to start talking ELINs. And you have to get into that. And if you guys have ELIN questions, I'm not going to dive deep into their use here. I've had to do a few deployments with them used fairly extensively. We can talk later. That gets complicated and gets complicated quickly. I will make one side note. Teams makes active use of the ELIN functionality with shared calling. That is how the emergency numbers in shared calling are used. It is an ELIN. We've talked about mobile users. They're easy. If you're on a cell phone, you get your location from your cell towers, you get it from your GPS, you're golden. If you can get it from neither of those and you're just on Wi-Fi, you're in the same boat as everyone else on a laptop. Can you get your location from GeoIP or manually enter it? Last but not least, we actually have someone in the audience who can speak to this. What if you actually have your own federally regulated PSAP or call center? How can you deliver this? How can you be compliant while at the same time delivering the calls to yourself and not notifying the county in which you operate? That's a question that has to be asked each county by county as you do this, and you have to work with your federal regulators. And in your case, you're lucky. You're working directly through your carrier, right? So you don't have to say, hey, Intrado or hey, Red Sky, I need you to take this, add me as a PSAP in your database and bounce it back to me while also adding the notification to the P routers. If you can do that, if you're fortunate enough to do that, great. I'm not going into how to build a PSAP in this particular discussion. I'm happy to have that discussion elsewhere. We're not talking about radio interoperability to add on to all of this at all. But if you have a private EMS or a PSAP, one of the things I would highly recommend you do is you contact Intrado, if you can't already work with your carrier to do it, and have them build it for you. Because they will do it for you and they will do it for you well. Ironic that a Canadian company is going to build American PSAPs, isn't it? And in fact has built probably most of them in concert with Motorola. And my clicker decides it doesn't want to work.
And said country, Canada, they send all their calls that come through the US to ECRC regardless of whether the application is or not.
Indeed. So we're going to go from the small to the medium to the big complications. Small complication. What if my network isn't ready? What if I don't know where everything is? I can think of maybe one or two. I mean, Torin, how many customers have you come to who actually had a network map? Like actually knew where everything was when you walked on board? Yeah, one or two who were close, like they had a general idea of their major operating centers, but then all their remote offices, it was a free-for-all, right? Well, whose job is it to fix this? Is it the implementer? Is it the operator, right? Every time I've gone into one of these contracts, we're told it's the implementer's job. One thing I want to be absolutely clear with, at least in the US, and Toronto, correct me if I'm wrong, in Canada, I don't think it's changed. The implementer's sole responsibility by law, and I'm not a lawyer, confirm this with your counsel, is make sure that the calls, a location can be detected, and a location can be delivered, and the correct PSAP can answer the call, and if not, the ECRC gets it.
To that point, not only does the location have to be discovered, but it has to depend on the square footage, certain radius, depending on the state.
So the question has to do with the weird regulations that instead of the feds defining everything, the states or counties, municipalities can say, hey, you have to be within a certain distance of the user, whether you're at their actual station or within a certain floor space or whatever. In this particular use case, this is before that. This is how do we figure out that mapping, right? But you're right, that's one of the complications. In the case of the implementer, by default, that's not your obligation to define. The implementer's job is to implement the system as required by the customer. The customer, I can't tell you how many of them I've said, go talk to your in-house counsel if you have one. If you don't, go talk to your out-of-house counsel and have them look at every jurisdiction in which you have a physical presence and a network. And have them find out what the lowest level you have to be is. Are you in Florida? Do you have to go to the station level? If that's the case, let's map your whole goddamn network the same way. Don't try and keep yourself, yes, it's easier if all my other sites don't have to do that, but now you've got a hodgepodge again. I love the network people. Most of the time, they're brilliant people. I don't want to call them lazy, but there's an efficiency of work ethic there that the network mapping is, having gone from being a physical cabler into the actual the network infrastructure side, I struggle with not having network maps. The operator is technically the person who is obligated to make sure all the information is accurate. If we, the implementer, are contracted to do all of that work, that's fine, but we still have to rely on the operator, their legal counsel, to define how anal do we need to be. At which point then, the question from the back.
So that's MLTS operator.
So whoever's in general, is it the MLTS or the network operator? Generally, it's the same thing, but yeah, tomato, tomato.
From a professional services standpoint, the operator would be the customer.
The operator is the customer from a professional services standpoint, right? So what are my local jurisdiction's requirements for dispatchable location? Do I need to go to the station? Do I only need to get to the floor? Do I need to get to the wing? I remember working with John Deere with their manufacturing facilities in the Quad Cities of Illinois area. They had massive, massive manufacturing facilities. And they had everything beautifully laid out with their network where they basically said, this pedestal serves this section of the facility. And all the switches on it, serve these whatever in this section of the facility. So we were able to go in and say, boom, great. You're compliant with the 40,000 square feet in Illinois, or it's that, or 7,000 feet. It's like them in Ohio or weird. But, and we were able to say, it's 40,000 in Illinois? Okay. We were able to go in and say, boom, we know based on our switch information how this works. And they'd even subnetted down to that level, which was a godsend for me. They'd actually done that planning for their own sanity, right? But they knew before, they weren't exactly within 40,000 square feet, but they were damn close already. So find this out. When you start a conversation with a customer, if you're not already the customer yourself, one of the things I or Torrin or someone's going to come in and say is, talk to your legal people. How deep do I have to go? Find that out before we go to your network team and tell them, we need this information. Because if I can tell the network team, all I need is your subnets, and you need to re-subnet to make this work for legal reasons, and I have to get your legal counsel involved, fine. But if I have to go and tell them, I need to know where every single one of your switch ports that is client-facing is connected, you can imagine why network teams hate me.
It's worse if it's wireless.
Well, the BSSIDs is a whole nother animal, right? I talked about Meraki being even another animal there.
They have multiple SSIDs.
Well, the BSS...
Depending on the bigger artists.
Well, so that's different, right? So every radio is going to have a BSSID. So that's not just the networks. That's number of radios times number of SSIDs is the total number of BSSIDs for each access point. It's nuts. So whose responsibility? Everyone's been raising this question, whether it was Ben in his how does location affect teams, not just in emergencies. How, Jamie, same thing. How do we keep this son of a gun up to date? Access points die, switches die. We upgrade from single gig to 10 gig. We went from 100 megabits. Go figure, we still have 100 megabit networks out there. How do we maintain this up? How do we update this? And whose responsibility is it? Now, implementer versus operator. I can't tell you the number of times I've been called by a customer that I've deployed and we tested and successfully trained them on how to update the data. It's no longer working. Well, did you replace a piece of equipment? Yeah. Did you update the LIS? No, that's your job. No, my contract was over 8 months ago. They can be audited and they can go to prison in some states. Is it Kentucky, I think, where the operator is a criminal offense, not civil, criminal. I don't know if it's still the case, but when I was doing it there was criminal if the operator did not have things accurate. Yeah. And while the organization may be fined, the actual IT person could go to jail. Nuts, right? Whose job is it? Is it the telephony team, the network team, the compliance team? It's everybody, right? Compliance and legal need to define how nitty-gritty you need to get. Telephony and network need to work together with facilities and security to say, okay, we need you guys to go out and port test every single one of our switches so we know where our patch panels are cross-connected to. Oh, that nightmare of a wiring job in the network closet is preventing you from accessing everything. Oh crap, now I need to get someone in there to rewire my network closet and spend 15 grand to do it, Again, network teams hate me. It's the one thing I can say as a saving grace or as a thank you to the people who wrote these regulations without being more specific was, thank you for helping me help network teams update their systems and come up to date and clean things up. Because I've been in a lot of environments where that, especially with analog wiring and analog telephony, that crap needed cleaning. But everything here falls on the operator. So unless you're an implementer who's then contracted into a managed services contract, make sure before you leave the environment, you have trained people on how to update this information in teams. When I was working for Converge One, we had a coworker, his name is Craig Timmons. He wrote a wonderful little tool for us using an Excel spreadsheet and a PowerShell script. That allowed us, as long as you could get all your information in the correct format, where you could then export everything you had in your LIS, wipe it if you wanted to, and you could re-import. And it would build out your addresses. It would build out your subnets, your access points, your all of it. It wasn't perfect for every situation. It was very niche, but as implementers, it was a good starting point for us. And he has it on, it's on GitHub, as long as his GitHub is still there. Okay, Andy Thompson's, okay. Yeah. So the point is there are a couple of people who've tried to tackle this from an automation standpoint. They have projects on GitHub. None of them truly well cover the concept of the updates. They're really all built around the whole deployment model and then exporting, backing up. All I can say is once every 6 months, have a check-in with your network teams and get an audited list of any new gear if you're doing network switch port, or BSSID, get an updated list of anything that's been deployed and update it. Make sure you're doing it at least once every 6 months. I haven't heard of very many audits occurring because there aren't really any auditors out there who know how to do the job. But there are certainly some auditors out there who think they know how to do the job and have levied some interesting fines over the years. So I would just much rather see you, maybe this location isn't correct, but it's in our list, we're updating it. I'd rather have you prepared. Yep.
I've seen a lot of problems with PowerShell script when you're populating via PowerShell script that it fails but it doesn't fail. PowerShell script doesn't fail, but the information doesn't populate correctly.
Well, so the comment is when using PowerShell, It's one of the quirks of PowerShell. Sometimes the information doesn't actually transmit properly. Sometimes you get an error when there was none, whether that's PowerShell itself, whether that's Microsoft's endpoint, not properly processing. That happens. There's nothing I can say to fix that, right? I mean, a script is a script is a script. If the script works and all of a sudden the same command is failing for some other reason, maybe redo it and then
I guess more of just something to look out for.
Oh, absolutely. Keep an eye on it. You're going to see it, but we don't have another option, unfortunately, in this case. Whereas if you're using, if we were able to do something just like an EGW as it sits, that had API endpoints. That had a SOAP API endpoint for ingest and egress. Okay. Yeah, so the comment is once you get to a certain number of objects in the list data, the ability to look it up, to process it, well, welcome to anything Microsoft where you're, especially querying via PowerShell, where you're trying to do things in a bulk, like get me all this data, it gets a little wonky. And I mean, again, I wish there was more I could do to help, but one of the things that's, I can rant and rave and I would testify to Congress on this one, but Congress is the wrong forum for it. The IEEE or the RFC committees, whatever, RPC. The held standard is great for looking up your location, right? If you have any held compliant server like an EGW, right? We struggle to put together network information, and we always end up saying, hey, this switch is in this location, this port is in this location, and we're doing it in a disparate system. Why can't we have a standardized protocol that's baked into anything that is IPv4 compliant, IPv6 compliant at the switch level, that because this information is now being used for more than just emergency services, but most critically for emergency services, right? Why is it when a switch is being deployed, part of the deployment model, whether you're doing it from the command line or you're doing it from Cisco DNA or a software-defined network platform, you aren't defining that as part of the switch deployment and stored in the switch configuration and in the database if you have an SD LAN controller, so that all of that can then be easily combined into a centralized solution. I'd love to see that. I would love, absolutely be thrilled to see the various networking equipment providers out there come together to define that as a standard and then allow held to be the standard query for all of this. And then you can go to Microsoft and say, hey, query my whatever network controller, pull in all of my whatever, and go, or just query it at the time of call. Is that likely to happen? I mean, pigs will fly, but I mean, I'd say, Torin, you get as frustrated about this as I do. Yeah. So, I mean, he's going to, if you have really complex, like why would I do something a certain way, Torin's session tomorrow is probably going to be a great forum for that. Of course, I'm around, Torin is here. I mean, after the conference, I imagine if you want to engage Cloud Revolution you're still working for Cloud Rev, right? Yeah. You'll need a contract, but we're happy to answer questions. We're happy to help you sort out or figure out what's best for your organization to do this. Just in the long run, we've got to do it. I don't expect to see it in Europe anytime soon. That said, supposedly Swisscom is supporting PIDFlow now and is doing their own PSAP setup for Switzerland only. But Europe, much like Canada, generally has nationalized systems, and they don't have quite as big a gap of where their PSAPs are. So in the US, instead of just having one for this little municipality in, excuse my language, bumfuck Montana, and one in New York City, and one in Seattle covering all of Montana. We have all these little PSAPs everywhere, so it makes this more complex, and it really does mandate us setting this up. Europe doesn't really have that complication, but they also have more strict privacy. In Germany, at the risk of losing security, your employer cannot know where you are. So implementing this could be a legal problem. Yeah. So like I said, we're here for another 5 minutes. If you have more questions here, otherwise,
So I have a question that was asked to me in passing recently, and I didn't know how to answer it.
I was working with a customer. We were talking about the work at home scenario where you can enter your own address and you can click the button and say, I verify it. And then in our logic, it heads out to the PSAP first. We're like, well, what would prevent you from putting in the address of your boss that you don't like and then calling 911, not speaking and swatting your boss? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So this is a hypothetical.
The total hypothetical. It was asked.
It's never been done. If what happens if you're a work from home user or you're out on the road, right? And what's to prevent you from in the Teams client putting in your boss's phone number, dialing emergency, saying I validate this is correct, calling 911 and hanging up and swatting, if you will, your boss's house. Well, one thing, unless your system is set up to cover your outbound caller ID, well, they're going to know who called because they're going to have your DID coming back in. And they are going to call you back if you hang up on them. And number two, if you do swat someone because they know who you were in the end, you're facing jail time.
Sure.
So I wouldn't do it. I mean, there's nothing to stop you programmatically from doing it.
That was my answer too. I couldn't find a programmatic spot. And I had the same conversation around caller ID presentation. Is it a PSTN user report? I mean, your company can find you, right? But the act still happens.
Yeah, you can't prevent the act.
The call still goes through. So they were asking me if there was any known reasonable efforts to take into play. I'm like, well, you can turn off the work at home thing, but now you might be in violation of some sort of local regulation. I am not a lawyer, right? So
Yeah.
That's exactly how the conversation went. They didn't ask the second time. So.
Yeah, so my initial response to that is have Microsoft change the priority and set that as non-validated and send you to the ECRC, so you actually have to audibly confirm the address.
Yeah, from what I've read documentation, it's manual entry, it always goes to the ECRC. If it's geolocated,
Yeah.
and you click confirm, then it goes to the PSAP. But if it's something that you go in and edit, then it's also manual, it goes to the ECRC.
So yes and no. So generally yes, correct. If Teams generates the address and says, is this where you are? And you say yes, they generally consider that as a validated and they'll send it onto the PSAP. A true straight up manual entry is supposed to be unvalidated. But again, remember what I said when we were looking at that PID flow record? And that entry in that XML packet says I can't remember exactly what the value is, but validated versus not. There's nothing to prevent someone from getting in there and changing that flag using SIP manipulation.
You gotta be back-end system administrator.
Absolutely, but my point is Microsoft absolutely, some things do fall through the cracks no matter what you do. But whether it comes through and it goes to the ECRC, which is the ideal in this situation, right? Or it goes straight to the PSAP, there are ways of finding it, just no ways of truly preventing it.
But as an end user, I can't.
No. No.
What do you know about throttling and dropping report chats when a phone's trying to pull the URL or emergency?
Sure.
Do you know anything about that on Microsoft side, like a throttling issue or any kind of discrepancies there?
So the question is have there been any issues, and I've only got a minute, with throttling when a phone tries to query its network location information? So the thing to be very, very clear about is if you're going to do anything besides subnet, whether it's Wi-Fi, switch and port, or just switch, remember LLDP is the protocol being used, not CDP, LLDP. So if you have any issues with LLDP at your switch level, absolutely it can be an issue. But as far as reporting it to Microsoft, the actual link between your client and Microsoft, different story, right? That's an API request going to Microsoft with all of the failbacks and follow-throughs of HTTP resiliencies, right? Going directly from a device to the switch or the port it's connected to get the information. I've never seen that as an issue because it's generally delivered as part of the IP address negotiation.
I have a question for you. It's more of a design question. I've heard two different thought processes on this when it comes to tertiary routing when ERS is not available. Right?
Sure.
Let's say your call routing is set up to where ERS LA, ERS New York are your first and second choices, and you're using a trot for your service provider. For whatever reason, you can't get to the primary ERS trunks. I've heard one camp of people say to ECRC and have them handle it. I've heard another, and I'm in the second camp, I've heard a second camp say, well, if your VoIP trunks are configured to provide at least a physical address for that same phone number using address to number mapping,
Any alley?
that's a better option because at least it's going to the correct jurisdiction PSAP. You're not having to talk to somebody to tell what the address
So
is.
you know it's the correct one though.
What's that?
You don't know it's the correct one though.
Right.
So the question is, what happens if you're in a direct routing scenario, right? If you've got your trunk, primary, second, you have your own fallbacks too, and we're going to use Intrado in this example, and 99 times out of 100, your trunks to Intrado are over the internet. They are not private. Intrado will sell you a private circuit, but 99 times out of 100, they are TCP over the internet. If those fail, the general recommendation, if you're using Intrado, specifically, Intrado will issue you a phone number that they own, and what you do is you take any 911 call egressing your system, change the destination to that phone number, and it goes to the ECRC, and because the source phone number, whatever the phone number is in your organization, stays the same, but it matches a number in the database at Intrado as served, you don't pay for that call at the ECRC. That is if you're using Intrado. If you're using Red Sky, if you're using someone else who backends to the Intrado ECRC and then charges you $70 to $100 for every one of those calls, I'd still do it if they can issue that number. Otherwise, my recommendation from a Microsoft specific perspective, every location gets an ELIN and you register those ELINs with your carriers. And if you have a gateway that supports ELINs, you license it as such. If you have an audio codes gateway or SBC, license the ELIN feature because it's you just turn it on and it's dynamic. It takes the ELIN out of the PID flow and does the mapping and ship that to the carrier. And the carrier can then route it properly using the P routers and all the other fun stuff. If you just ship that normal number out, it's just gonna go to whatever billing address corporately you've got registered. So if you're serving nationally from one trunk, they're going to go to wherever the corporate office is. That would be how I would do it. Any other questions? Otherwise, we can speak outside. I think the next presenter, or are we done for the day? We're done for the day. Oh, great. I can take questions. We'll end the recording and we'll keep taking questions outside of that.